All right.
Did you find matters?
Yeah, we did. Thank you so much. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out today. This is like Ed said earlier, this is the first speaker series that they've had in person here in a couple of years. I'm sure we all know why. And so a little bit of, right around the holidays, so I'm sure everyone has a million different things going on. But today I'm here to talk about planting for pollinators. And the type of pollinators that we're going to discuss today are mostly insect pollinators. And it's one of my favorite topics to talk about is bugs. So obviously super informal. If you have any questions, just stop me and ask. I have about 40 slides to get to. And yeah, so if you have any questions, I'm going to bring up our landscape recognition program, since some of you are interested in that, and then talk about our projects that we have going on here for the University of Florida and with our Master Gardener volunteers on some of our pollinator gardens that we're trying to get established throughout the Keys. So, as Ed said, I am the horticulture agent down here, but I'm also the coordinator for the Master Gardener program. And the majority of my outreach is towards the commercial audience and the residential audience, and we also have to do some of our programming to youth as well. About 5% of my overall programming efforts go to youth outreach. So dabble in a little bit of everything, and that's why Master Gardener volunteers are so vitally important to what I do, because I'm one person, and obviously reaching that many different audiences throughout the Keys can be pretty challenging. And so I rely very heavily on our volunteers. Terry is one of our volunteers here, and it's just so important to help in what I do. So as you can see here, we have one of our beautiful mangrove skippers. This is on our Florida Keys blackweed, which is a phenomenal plant. We'll talk about it a little more as we get throughout the presentation. But yeah, mangrove skippers here are just absolutely beautiful. The undersides of the leaf, they have this, the wings, they have this beautiful iridescent blue, and they feed their larval host plant is red mangroves. So if you live near mangroves, you probably have had these beautiful little pollinators visit your yard. And so a little bit of what we're going to talk about today is just really the overall benefits that insects provide us, not only in pollination services, but so many different ways that we rely on them to support our ecosystems and different things. The basics of a pollinator garden, and last year when I kicked off this speaker series, we talked about butterfly gardening. So this is going to tie in very closely to that as well. That last presentation was very specific to butterflies, and they are also very important pollinators, butterflies and moths, especially in natural ecosystems. But we have a wide variety of pollinators that really people don't think about. I think when people think about pollinators, they think of the honeybee, and it is so much more diverse than that. Our honeybees are not to be understated, very important pollinators. They pollinate over about 100 different food crops for us. But they are actually not indigenous to the United States. They are imported from Europe. And when people think about our insect populations and the world species that are declining overall, and so much attention gets paid to honeybees, unfortunately, we have a lot of other native bee species that are in much more critical state as far as dwindling populations as opposed to the honeybees. In Florida alone, we have 300 different native bee species. So that is quite diverse, and they do very important ecological services for us, not only in pollination services, but so many different important aspects as well. And then, of course, throughout the presentation, you'll see a lot of pictures of plants that attract these pollinators in our yards here in the Keys. A little bit of eye candy for you throughout the presentation. And then some resources like I mentioned earlier. All of these photos that you see here, Mr. Terry took for us. He is not only one of our volunteers, but quite an accomplished photographer. And so this is just a little, taste of, here's a leafcutter bee, pushback fly, paper wasp, syrphid flies. All of these are very important pollinators for our ecosystems here, and also have other aspects in pest control as well. So many insects do double duty. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with lady beetles. Lady beetles are very popular. Everyone wants to purchase lady beetles and release in their yard to have this wonderful natural pest control services that lady beetles provide. But also, when populations of their food source are low, they also feed on nectar as well. So again, not only are they very important for pest control services they provide, but also can have provide us some pollination services in our landscapes as well. So it may be hard to think about, especially as gardeners, but of the 4 million insect species worldwide, about less than 1% are actually harmful to us or our plants. The rest are very beneficial or do not harm us or benefit us in either way. They're just going about their lives existing much like we are. But as a gardener, it may not seem like that. You know, it may seem like you're constantly inundated with aphids and whiteflies and mealybugs and all these different pests in your garden. But the truth be told, there are many more beneficial insects out there, beneficial bugs doing such fantastic services for us. And there are ways that we can harness some of those benefits that they provide. And just little things that we can do in our landscape, little adjustments that we can make, maybe increasing the size of the quantity of plants or increasing the amount of plant beds we have in our landscape. Just little things that we can do to help attract more of these beneficial insects to our landscapes and provide a wide variety of services. Think of all the money you'll save on chemicals from pesticides and that sort of thing, just being able to attract these beneficial bugs to our yard. So they are the dominant players in the animal kingdom. They preceded us by 350 million years, and they represent more than half of the known living organisms on Earth. To put that in perspective, like I said, there are about 4 million insects worldwide. New insects are being discovered every day. Unfortunately, also at that same rate, we're probably losing species as well, unfortunately. But to put that in perspective, there are only about 3,500 different bird species. So think of all the different birds in the world, and that's about 3,500. And there are 4 million insects. So they really do, they are the most diverse group of animals and just provide us with so many benefits. But we have a war on bugs, right? Ever since the Industrial Revolution, it seems like our pesticide use and our ideals about insects have changed. We've really gone from a place of where we have a zero tolerance policy in our landscapes. And it's unfortunate, again, because we'll talk about all of these different good things that they do for us. So this is a chart from the Environmental Protection Agency on a pesticide report that they published for 2008 to 2012. And this graph specifically talks about our pesticide expenditures at the producer level. These two different bars here are worldwide numbers versus the United States. And just in 2012 alone, we spent nearly $56 billion on pesticides. Now, pesticides is an overall broad term. I know sometimes people get confused about that. They think pesticides we're inherently talking about insecticides, and that's just not the case. Pesticides includes herbicides, or weed killer, so to speak, fungicides, many different types. Fungicides, insecticides, fumigants also, fumigants for like termites. And so as you can see, here is that 56 billion worldwide. Put this into perspective, here in the United States, the majority, over half of that is represented in herbicide use. And as you can imagine, the majority of that is in the agricultural sector. However, if you look at insecticide use, then this is home and garden and ag here, the black part of the bar represents ag, and the lighter color represents in home landscapes, essentially. We're using more insecticides in our home landscapes than they are in agriculture. So that has a major impact. And when we talk about, diversity loss, and you've probably seen headlines of insects populations are declining, rapidly worldwide. And scientists do believe that we are in our 6th mass extinction event right now because of the amount of diversity, biodiversity that we are losing and the rate at which we are losing it. It's incredible. And not only is that, land clearing, habitat loss, urbanization play a part in that, but also our rampant use of insecticides, including herbicides, because while the target of those products may not directly be insects, what is that doing? It's removing habitat. Weeds, as we'll talk about a little bit, provide really an important habitat for a lot of different pollinators, and oftentimes have a high amount of nectar availability. So indirectly, herbicides are also affecting insect populations because of that, again, that habitat loss. And so, part of what I do is sustainable education with regards to landscaping and gardening. And so how can we merge as gardeners? How can we, have more of an appreciation for what insects provide us in our landscape, and also have an aesthetic threshold of what we're able to tolerate as far as herbivory on our plants. We have to be able as gardeners to be willing to accept some level of damage to our plants. We really shouldn't have a zero threshold policy, because that's just not a sustainable approach. Again, as you're spraying for different organisms, you're also killing off the beneficial organisms, because like we said, majority of those insects that are in your yards, either knowingly or unknowingly, benefit you in some way, or benefit your gardens and plants in some way. So not only in addition to the pollination services that insects provide, there's so many important wonderful things that insects do for us. The decomposing plant minerals and help with the nutrient cycling process of returning those nutrients back into the soil. So we have our shredders, other arthropods that are eating the plant tissue, and then as they're excreting that material, then you have fungi and bacteria that are breaking that material down even further, and then those nutrients that were originally within the plant that have now been broken down into a type of nutrient that the plant's roots can take back up. And so all part of the nutrient cycling process that, once we remove those insects, or not providing a habitat for them to thrive, they're, again, another part of the problem, or another piece of the puzzle unravels. Now we start to have nutrient deficiencies in our landscape, and all of this is kind of a cycle. It's really the point that I wanted to get at, is that by disturbing any part of that cycle has consequences down the road. Aerate and enrich the soil, again, biological control and natural pest control services that insects provide us. Think of, again, we've already talked about lady beetles and lacewings and praying mantis and all these different organisms that are predators of other insects or parasitize other insects. And so we don't have to even worry about that. We don't have to come in with our arsenal of chemical equipment and sprays and wage a war against the plants in our garden, because there's a natural process going on. There was article that was published on the economic value of ecological services provided by insects. And it was, this is a link to the article. It was John Mosey and Mace Vaughn, if you're interested in looking that up, and put a price tag of $57 billion, that the worth of the ecological services provided by insects is worth $57 billion annually. And that was based not only on pollination services, but in dung removal. Think about how important that is in a cattle farm. Also pest control services. And so, again, just trying to put an economic value on something that we don't think about often. And why we're here today, obviously, pollination services are so vital. Approximately 80% of all flowering plant species are specialized for pollination by animals, but mostly insects. And about 35% of our world's food crops depend on insects as pollinators. So when we talk about worldwide, this overall decline in insect species that is going on right now, it can be pretty scary to think about the number of different species that we're losing with this biodiversity loss. And again, pollination services, just in the US alone, was valued at $20 billion worth of products that we are provided in the way of fruits, vegetables, honeys, materials, wax, and different things like that. So as you can see, there isn't one honeybee included on this slide. And all of these insects here are important pollinators. There are about 40 different species of yucca. And with every species of yucca, there's an equally specialized yucca moth for that species. And so, their evolution is very closely tied. This one species of moth can only pollinate this one particular species of yucca. You can't get more specialized than that. Then, draw your attention to this little nondescript little midge that, in reality, is probably the size of a pin drop. That single insect right there is responsible for all of our chocolate on Earth. Now, I think that little fly is worth saving. Unfortunately, though, what we've been talking about already is, again, their populations are declining. Because where cacao is produced, Central America, South America, Asia, those regions, what are we losing? A lot of rainforests. Rainforests are being cleared to make way for cacao plantations, just to name one crop that is affecting that ecosystem. And so, again, vital habitat is being gained, but at the expense of some very important natural ecosystems. And we lose about a third of cacao plantations each year just to pests and disease. Because why? We've cleared all of that natural habitat that's around that is an important habitat for all of those beneficial organisms that come in and feed on those other insects and diseases and help keep the balance of that system in place. So, what we do can have a huge impact as humans. So, save chocolate is the bottom line there. Save the insects, save the chocolate, it's a win-win. So, as we are increasing areas, as we're clearing land, as we're, more urbanization, more people are moving into urban areas at an alarming rate. Not so much here in the Keys, of course, but in other areas of the state. It's said that 1,000 people move to Florida every day. Now, I don't know, that number is always thrown out there, and I don't know, where that statistic comes from. But a lot of people are moving to Florida, and which means that they have to go somewhere. And so, we're losing a lot of natural habitat to agriculture, to urbanization, to these other things, invasive species. As these exotic species that we bring in, can now regenerate and have nothing keeping them in check here in our landscapes. That's in vital habitat that's being lost to natural ecosystems. So we can have, as gardeners, we can have a really positive impact by just creating a more natural habitat in our own landscapes, by looking at it, the bigger picture, more of an ecological perspective of how our landscapes can be pathways for beneficial organisms and connect them to larger areas of conservation. And so instead of just looking at it as a, this is just, I'm doing this because it's visually appealing to me and I like flowers, just even the way we think about things and changing our mindset of, okay, my garden is actually providing some ecological services here. And really there's small little changes that you can make in your landscape that can have a huge impact. And this isn't going to look the same for everyone. What I may have a preference for and you may have a preference for is going to be completely different. Where I may want a more natural, informal landscape, you may like a more professional and manicured landscape. And that doesn't mean one way is wrong over the other. It's just different. And how are you able to expand your yard to provide some of those services? Again, it may also be different than what I'm able and capable of doing. And so this is part of something we'll talk about a little bit later, is we kind of have a mission here with our environmental horticulture program and with the Master Gardener volunteers, is kind of creating more of these pollinator habitats and demonstration teaching gardens to kind of get that message out there. So what are the basics of creating a pollinator garden? Well, obviously choose plants that are native to your region, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Nectar and pollen-rich sources are going to be very important, which including a range of shapes, size, and colors. So when we talk about plant diversity, we're not only talking about the number of plants that increasing in your yard and increasing the number of different plants you have, but also the texture, the colors in the flowers, the shapes of the flowers, diversity within those too, because obviously without the thousands of pollinators we're able, or hundreds of, or thousands, whatever your landscape has, whatever you're able to attract is going to be dependent on, is there a source of food there for them? And obviously, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We have small pollinators and big pollinators. And of course, their nutritional needs and what they're going to be able to access within that plant are going to be different as well. Avoiding any modern hybrids and cultivars, and we'll talk about that. And of course, we just mentioned this, including a variety of plants that bloom throughout the different seasons. So of course, you want to have something there that there's a food source throughout the year. Not really a big factor for us here, because we don't really have a dormancy period down here. So we have the opportunity, and especially in this tropical environment, to include nectar and pollen sources year-round. We're pretty lucky in that regard. And avoid landscape fabric. What we mentioned, the many different native bees that we have here. Many of those bees are ground nesting bees. And so by putting down that landscape fabric, again, you're just making a barrier to where those bees would not be able to access the ground for nesting purposes. And to some degree, mulch as well. I mean, we talk about mulch and many benefits that mulch provide, especially for us down here with our poor calcareous soils. But there are, maybe leaving some areas of your yard, the ground a little bare for those ground nesting pollinators or ground dwelling pollinators. And of course, we've talked about this a little bit already, avoiding those toxic chemicals that are going to be harmful to the pollinators that you're trying to attract to your yard. And so it all starts with native plants, right? This doesn't mean that we don't want to have any non-native plants in the landscape, but where there's some areas where we can increase the number of native plants in our landscape, because native plants and our native insects share an evolutionary history. And so by including a more diversity of natives, it's going to be a favorite location for our native pollinators. Kind of makes sense, right? And then the double bonus that we have here is that by including plants in our landscape that are native to our environment, that thrive here in our harsh conditions, because make no mistake, this is a harsh environment for us down here, especially if we're trying to bring some red maples or or other plants from Central Florida and trying to make them work here, it just doesn't work that way. We are truly a tropical environment, and we have some environmental things with our soil, our easterly sea breezes that are high in salinity that make it hard for other plant species, non-native plant species to thrive here. It doesn't mean that they won't. It just means that if this is our goal, if our goal is to attract the most amount of beneficial insects and pollinators to our yard, then we want to incorporate as many native plants as possible. And because they can flourish in our landscapes with minimal fertilization and pesticide use. Of course, that does mean right plant, right place. We just can't take a native plant and stick it in our yard and think that it's going to thrive. For instance, silver buttonwood. Silver buttonwood thrives in an entirely sunny location. If you plant a silver buttonwood that you want to hedge underneath your wonderfully huge, nice ficus tree, and a portion of that hedge is going to be shaded for a good portion of the day, it's not going to look good. It's going to look leggy. It's going to drop foliage. There's going to be black spots on your leaves. Why? Because it doesn't want to be there. It wants the sun. So again, that concept of right plant, right place still does apply. And so this is just a wonderful selection of native plants that we included here. American beautyberry, Keys ageratum, our native lantana. We'll talk about that a little bit, and bay cedar. We'll talk about these in a little more detail. Are you members of the garden? Okay, so you should know, I would hope that you would know how wonderful of a fantastic nursery that you have here. It really is for the staffing that they have there, and the size of the nursery. What they are able to produce is no short of amazing. So you have this wonderful local source of plant material that is really fantastic. They also get, through the Florida Department of Agriculture, there is an Endangered Plant Advisory Council that's mixed with researchers and people in academia, and there's a representative from the Garden Club Association, and just a wide diversity of people that sit on this advisory council. And they have a bit of money that they give out to different organizations that are doing research and propagation on endangered and threatened plants. Very vitally important for us because we lose a lot of our plant species in addition to our insect species dwindling populations because of, again, habitat loss, and for us, sea level rise is an important factor in that as well. And so once we lose that, genetic diversity, it's gone forever. And so the nursery here, the Botanical Society here, is one of the, I think, 4 recipients across the state that does get money to do research and propagation of some of the threatened and endangered plants we have here in the Keys. And so that little nursery is doing some really important work for us here, and I'm sure you appreciate it, but I just wanted to reiterate. And about 85% of the plants that we used in our wildflower demonstration garden came from there. So really fantastic resource that we have down here. So this is from a document about the basics of creating a wildlife habitat, and it really is essentially the same principles, whether we're trying to attract, do a butterfly garden or a pollinator garden, or have a wildlife habitat. It's the same thing. We're trying to attract native fauna to our yards. And so each native plant species is a member of a community that includes other plants, animals, microorganisms. The natural balance keeps each species in check. Plants thrive in conditions to which they are adapted. However, other organisms, for example insects, prevent plants from spreading uncontrolled. Thus, native species rarely become invasive, unlike some of our exotic invasive plants, which we'll talk about quickly. Plants imported from other areas, they have no natural organisms, no natural predators here in our ecosystems, in our environment, and so oftentimes they can spread quite rapidly. And that's from one of the publications by the University of Florida.
I can't read the names at the bottom of the flower.
Oh, I know, I'm sorry. So again, and all of these I'll touch on a little bit, but this is firebush. It is again, and with a lot of our natives, there's actually been non-natives, same non-native, plant, not the same, but a close relative, non-native brought in. And so we have a non-native firebush and a native firebush. And unfortunately, what happens in this situation, much like the porterweed here, we have a native blue porterweed that grows much different than the non-native porterweed. And what happens, they're so closely related that they often will hybridize in the wild. And this becomes problematic because then you lose that genetic diversity of your truly native species and the characteristics that have kept that species going for hundreds of thousands of years. And so, again, this is just another reason. There's a couple examples there with firebush. It's happening, and it's become harder and harder to find truly native firebush because of that hybridization that's going on between the non-native and native species, and also with blue porterweed because you'll see weird characteristics happening through hybridization. Flowers are a little different, leaf is a little different, maybe growth habit. I'm sorry. And this is our native Lantana and Keys ageratum. And the yellow tops is a wonderful, fantastic native plant. They grow it here at the nursery. They grow two different varieties. There's a clustered yellow top and a narrow leaf yellow top. We've put both of them in our wildflower garden, and our soils were pretty rich, actually, ironically, where our garden is. And so the narrow leaf yellow top just kind of grew out of control. And here's a situation of a plant that really thrives in a very harsh environment, roadsides, right in that coral rock, very low nutrient environment. And you're taking it, and we're putting it in our demonstration garden that has getting mulch and just has all this wonderful nutrition and exploded in growth. And for us, the clustered yellow tops seem to have a better growth habit in a landscape situation. Some native plants, just a few that kind of do some dual duties. So I adapted some of these slides from a presentation I gave about wildlife and attracting birds to your yard. Again, about 95% of our birds, especially your migratory birds, rely on not only our native berries and seeds and everything, but even a portion of their diet, especially when they're rearing their young, is insects. I mean, caterpillars are really high in protein. And so think about it, everyone's excited about attracting birds to their yards, me as well. But what are, if we're not providing them any food, they're not going to be coming to our yards any regularly if there's no food source. So especially when they're rearing their young, if we've eliminated any caterpillars in our landscape, what's keeping them around? But this is American Beauty. This is a really fantastic plant. The bees and butterflies love the flowers. And look at these beautiful berries that attract catbirds, mockingbirds, all sorts of different bird species. Yes?
I have this one, and it's very lanky.
It is.
You chop it.
You can chop it. Yeah. You can
Yeah.
prune it back down to the ground. I'd say 6 to 12 inches off the ground, and it'll grow back nice and full. Yeah. There's some things that we have like that can get leggy over time, and they just do. They need a nice, haircut, so to speak, like we do.
Can you do that with scorpion weed too? And I think it's what's a rogue plant that gets
Rouge plant? Oh, yeah.
Can
Mhm.
you chop it?
Yeah.
down?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
And more likely than not, you're going to get more pop-up from seed and other things, especially with scorpion tail and rouge plant. They pop like they pop up all over the place. Another thing for us here is iguanas. So that makes life really challenging as a gardener because iguanas are able to adapt their diet so easily. But this does seem to be one that iguanas do not prefer. Florida Keys blackweed was the photo in the first slide. Fantastic workhorse for us in our yards. It is extremely salt tolerant and drought tolerant. So again, one of those once it's established in your landscape, you don't need to fertilize or anything. It is also a larval host plant. When I say larval host plant, that means it's a caterpillar food source for different butterfly species. So there's 3 different butterfly species that use this plant as a caterpillar food source. So in addition to the dynamic amount of pollinators that will be attracted to this plant when it's in bloom, which it is blooming right now, it is also a food source for caterpillars. Here we have, again, mangrove skipper. We have the oleander moth here, carpenter bee, the white, Florida white butterfly here, and again, blooms vary from white to pinkish. They're fragrant. They're absolutely beautiful, and then they get these really cool coiled pods. And again, birds that will just love those. So, a wonderful plant in the landscape. Yes?
This is dioecious. Everything I've gotten pretty much everything over at that garden that they sell, and I seem to get all the boys.
No, it's not. It's not.
Okay. All right.
Just means you have to add more and keep trying.
Running out of space.
Again, for more shadier parts of your landscape, to also not only great for bees and butterflies when they're in flower, but these beautiful red berries. We have 3 different wild coffee that are native to the Florida Keys. And again, do like a little shadier location, so it might be something to where maybe some of your Asteraceae, more of the herbaceous stuff that you would think about in a pollinator garden might not be appropriate in a shadier part of your landscape. But some things like this that are going to perform dual duties of being a food source for birds, but also when they're in flower, be an excellent pollinator source.
So, have you heard of Douglas Talmy?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, he's my hero.
Yeah.
He said that the top 5% of an ecosystem, the plants that are the most redundant in an ecosystem, will carry about 75% of the biodiversity in an ecosystem. So my question, which I'm trying to figure out, what are the keystone species? What are the most important species? If you see any of them that we touch on, could you say, yeah, that might be, it could be a keystone species? Because again, they support roughly just a small percentage will support 75. It will keep most of the biodiversity going.
Okay.
So there's
really not specific to keystone species, but what I would say is having that diversity, having not only with the variety, but that vertical diversity of having large trees and smaller trees and the shrub size and the ground cover, including that so that you're, again, attracting just a wide variety of birds and other organisms, not only pollinators and insects, that you'll have that whole ecosystem in place. And so keeping that fairly intact as much as possible. So doing what you can of where you can add those different species into your yards. I'll show you like a gumbo limbo in bloom. When a gumbo in full bloom is covered with bees, especially our native palm trees. We have 6 palms that are native to the Keys, and when those are in bloom, it is just absolutely covered in different bees. And so I wouldn't say a particular species, so to speak, and maybe that is a better question for some of our biologists. But again, making sure that you have that not only a food source, but a habitat as far as shelter and water, and providing all of the different elements with that different vertical, diversity as well. This is another really important one. I wouldn't say, again, I'm not going to say a keystone species, but this is our native lantana, where many people are familiar with the lantana that grow more as a ground cover. Again, have really become invasive and are not native. This is a native lantana that we have, but grows more like a shrub. it is in flower year-round. And so, you know, when we have, like right now, when we're getting into times where the predominant part of many of our hammocks and you know, mangrove ecosystems, none of that is blooming. This blooms year-round, blooms fruits year-round. So you will have a continual supply of beetles and ants and bees and butterflies and moths always on this particular plant, in addition to our migratory season when we, this is a favorite for mockingbirds and catbirds, and so when you, so during the migratory season you see these little purple to pink berries, extremely important food source. Again, it may get a little leggy after time, but again, that's another one that can take pruning quite fine. Very high salt tolerance, very high drought tolerance. Again, it's not one that's going to be preferred by iguanas for us here. And so, although it doesn't grow, doesn't have the same growth habitat as our the non-native lantanas that are more ground covers, this is going to be more of an upright woody shrub. But an excellent plant in the landscape, and if you're trying to create a pollinator garden, I would absolutely say this is a necessity. And again, another fantastic one. This is another one where there's also a non-native type versus our native yellow necklace pod. This is going to be another one that these get pretty sizable. It can, unpruned, it can get and spread is, you know, 6 to 8 feet, as wide as it is tall. But again, another one for us is really important for drought and salt tolerance for us here for us down here. It will also attract hummingbirds. So will the firebush and some of the other plants that we've talked about as well. You may have a problem with genista moth caterpillars, which is a really indescript moth, but it can really extremely defoliate a couple times a year. So that's one thing to consider.
Okay, I think I have that.
Yeah. And so again, you know, each pollinator has its own techniques for sourcing the nectar and pollen within the flowers. And so again, just creating that diversity with not only the color and shapes and size, but also, you know, planting in mass as well. So not just a one here and one there and one here, that where you can group plants together would be better, because it would be easier for pollinators to locate that material when things are planted in groups, even not only just a particular species, but just a color scheme as well. And so this was adapted. I threw this in here. Again, this kind of all goes together when we're just, in general, talking about attracting fauna to our landscapes. This is a Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. As you can see here, this was, you know, what to put in your yard to attract birds. Again, it gets back to that upper canopy, mid canopy, shrub and ground layer, so where you're providing shelter, not only food, but also shelter from the elements. And so what it might look like here in the Keys, you know, with our upper canopy trees, you know, wild tamarind, gumbos, some smaller species that we have, Jamaica caper, cinnamon bark, you know, down to the shrub layer, some of those that we've already talked about. And then of course our, you know, herbaceous plant material that, you know, it would be more indicative to a pollinator garden. The yellow top, white mouth dayflower, scorpion tail, some of the things that we've already talked about, and what you might be able to attract here as far as birds here in the Keys. But again, a lot of this is interchangeable. You know, we're talking about pollinator gardens and butterfly gardens, and really a lot of the ideas are very overlapping. We're trying to attract fauna, native fauna to our yards, and there are elements within each of those that are pretty unanimous throughout. And so again, making sure that nectar plants, you're including nectar plants, which are so incredibly important for energy and nutrition. We've already talked about, you know, a lot of pollinators are generalists, but you do have specialist pollinators as well that only, you know, will feed on a very small range of different species. And oftentimes, you know, in a pollinator garden, you're looking at plants within the aster, mint, verbena plant families.
With the blue porter weed, mine are growing like.
It's non-native.
It's non-native.
Right.
Pull it and it's something else, you think? Because they're really big.
I would. You can get
Okay.
the native ones are ground covers, so they stay close to the ground.
Okay, I'll pull it.
If you get the native one, definitely I would recommend pulling it because they're going to hybridize.
Okay.
And so yeah, completely different growth habit. Again.
Thank you.
Keys ageratum is one of our, again, fantastic native plants that we have here. I believe it's endangered. It's either endangered or threatened. They grow it here at the nursery. This is a butterfly magnet. It's going to bloom. It's been blooming for us throughout the year in our wildflower garden. It not only will spread by seed, but you can see this through the lateral stems. It's going to be spreading that way as well. So as it grows, you can dig some up, put it in other parts of your yard as it starts to spread. But it's pretty much bloomed year-round, and it's really a fantastic pollinator attractor, especially butterflies, especially monarchs. Absolutely love the Keys ageratum. Again, some of the other plants that we've talked about, Highland croton, another fantastic native to include in your yard. It looks nothing like a typical croton that you've probably used in your landscape. Scorpion tail. This is fiddlewood, lignum vites, goatweed. Again, probably not something you're going to be able to come across in a nursery situation, but it's a weed that grows down here, a wonderful attractor for different pollinators. And this is a Florida Keys indigo, another endangered plant we have down here that, again, all of these are just really fantastic nectar plants. And so when we're talking about pollinator gardens, obviously that does include butterfly gardens. Butterflies are also very important pollinators, and some considerations. Again, we talked about this the last time when I did the speaker series of what components you need in a butterfly garden. And obviously it's those nectar plants that we've been talking about, but also the caterpillar food source. If you don't have those caterpillar plants, you're really not going to be able to complete that life cycle and have butterflies stick around for their entire life cycle. And so as gardeners, it may be a hard concept to try and swallow that, yeah, your plants are going to be chewed. That's the whole part of a butterfly garden, is these caterpillars are eating those plants and then will turn into butterflies. And so again, we have that structural diversity, there's shelter, there's enough diversity of nectar sources throughout the seasons. Again, a lot of the same things that we've already been talking about. Really, if you are trying to attract butterflies, it would probably be wise to have an area where you're not spraying pesticides, because it's going to be very detrimental to the caterpillars that are feeding on those plants. Some good, caterpillar host plants for us are native. We have a couple different native sennas, or that used to be cassia. Here, the Senna mexicana, champani, ligristrina. There are two native species that we have that will be host plants for the cloudless sulfur, sleepy orange sulfur, and our orange barred sulfur. Not very salt tolerant, but they're somewhat drought tolerant. This, unfortunately, is going to be a plant that the iguanas will absolutely destroy. So if iguanas are a problem in your landscape, you're going to want to protect these plants at least while they're small. We have roof flashing around the two plants that we just installed in the wildflower garden. They've killed them 3 times already. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that I figured it out this time and they can't put rocks into the flashing, and so hopefully they can't dig underneath and get into there. They love this. Here at the botanical garden, you'll see senna throughout the garden. Again, once they get to a certain size, I wouldn't say that they leave them alone, but the plant is more tolerant of that predation. Really, it's kind of hard to see on this, so I'm going to go again, some of the plants that we've already talked about, Pineland croton is also a caterpillar host plant for the endangered Bartram's scrub hair streak. Florida leaf-wing butterfly, bay cedar is another wonderful plant that to include in your yards if you're trying to attract butterflies and pollinators. This is also a wonderful, forms a nice informal hedge. So if you're looking for a natural kind of screening, this would be a really fantastic plant to include. Highly salt tolerant. Again, it is a caterpillar host plant for a couple of different butterfly species. And you know, it's the small ones. It's not the big flashy ones that everyone thinks of. But your numbers of the different butterflies that it can attract, though small, will be quite abundant. And so this isn't going to be a plant that you would want to formally shape into a hedge. It would be a more natural, allow it to kind of grow because it's not going to tolerate that redundant pruning. Spurred butterfly pea, and again, I've already talked about Florida keys blackweed. Just some different plants that, again, do dual jobs in the yard by attracting pollinators, but also provide that necessary food source for butterfly caterpillars. And then I mentioned earlier, avoid hybrids. So these are man-made cultivars in a landscape setting. So they're taking a plant and they're breeding it for specific qualities, larger blooms. Some are bred for the fact that insects will, for the insect avoidance qualities to not attract insects. And so obviously, these aren't going to be the nectar and pollen are not going to be very accessible to pollinators. And so the characteristics they've been bred for makes that nectar harder to access for pollinators. So wouldn't be something that you would want to include in your landscape for that purpose. Maybe another part of your yard where you just love that showy, like a double hibiscus is an excellent thing to talk about. That is that the quality of that double flower really makes the nectar inaccessible to insects.
Same thing for roses too.
Yeah. Yes.
Single petal, great. It's
Yep.
a nectar source. All others, not so much.
We touched on this a little bit already, but can we be a little more mindful about the way we manage our weeds in our yards? A little bit more tolerant, or of allowing maybe some areas to, if that's the goal that we're looking for. If we're looking, for a pollinator garden, and this isn't going to be for everyone, but if you have an area of your yard where you just want to leave, natural and let it grow, and that's going to be a wonderful habitat for all sorts of beneficial organisms, including pollinators. For us here, we talk about frog fruit a lot. It has a lot of different names. Creeping Charlie. If you're, transplants from other parts of the world where grass grows quite easily, I'm sure you may be familiar with this as, something you didn't want in your yard, as it really establishes in turf grass very easily. And so a lot of money is spent controlling this particular quote-unquote weed. But turf grass doesn't grow very readily for us here because of some of the environmental things we've already talked about, our high pH in our soil, the salinity issues. So turf grass is hard to grow down here, and it takes a lot of inputs: water, fertilizer, pesticides. Whereas this, native frog fruit will grow everywhere, and really it'll cover an area much like turf does. It can be mowed just like turf. If you have it, you're just growing in with your turf, that's fine. You can walk on it, drive on it, so it has a lot of applications for us here in the Keys. And additionally, it is, again, another caterpillar food source for several different butterfly species. And so not only, would you have these beautiful blooms popping up in your yard, again, throughout the year, but as areas of your turf may die out, if you have turf, it might be something you consider, putting some frog fruit in there just to grow among the turf, because it's not going to require all those additional inputs of water and fertilizer and different things that turf do. And so especially as salinity becomes more of a problem for us as sea level continues to rise, turf is going to be a less hospitable environment for turf down here. And then of course we have the wonderful Spanish needles. Fantastic butterfly pollinator attractor. In fact, it could give beekeepers, honey beekeepers, that kind of second flow because there's just so much nectar and it's loaded up in Spanish needles. Not necessarily a desirable landscape plant though. It's very aggressive and it will grow everywhere. And it's not all that flashy or showy either. So we actually, take it out of our wildflower garden just because it's so hard to manage and it grows so quickly and it'll take over so that it becomes a high maintenance issue.